Good morning. Welcome. Welcome on this very, very frigid morning. Wherever you're joining from, I hope that you're feeling warm and cozy right now. Well, I'll take a moment. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Closser Pert. I'm the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at United Way of Metro Chicago. And we're so excited to be here with you this morning to celebrate the legacy of a great leader and advocate for equity and for peace, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who you may or may not be aware actually lived briefly in Chicago. You'll learn much more about this from our featured speaker today, Chicago's best storyteller, Shermann Dilla Thomas. But before we begin, I found that many people know the name United Way, but not everyone understands exactly what we do. So we'd like to take a moment to just share a video describing our work.
For many years, organizations have really been siloed to their specific areas. But if we can all band together to approach that same issue, the issue doesn't stand a chance. That's why the United Way Neighborhood Network has been such a game changer for us.
The United Way Neighborhood Network Initiative plays such a critical role in helping to partner folks like us, ITW and other corporations, with the community organizations that are working collaboratively to bring about change in the neighborhood.
We are here today to make a significant announcement that will not only hopefully transform the West Side, but the South Side and neighborhoods that have been starving for resources for way too long.
I love the neighborhood networks and our $10 million donation. It really showed in real dollar terms our trust in the United Way and the neighborhood network model.
The Chicago Community Trust, along with the United Way of Metro Chicago, have partnered with community leaders to invest $35 million in neighborhood businesses and pandemic resources as part of a COVID relief and recovery effort.
We reach out to United Way and other partners every opportunity we get because we know that together we can get a lot more done than we could ever do alone.
United Way of Chicago is receiving a big gift from Mackenzie Scott this holiday season.
Research shows Black and brown-led nonprofits receive less funding than their white counterparts. But now a new program by the United Way of Metro Chicago is working to address this disparity.
When United Way first approached us about the United Neighborhoods Equity Fund, we knew right away that this was a great match for us.
I'm grateful that United Way has taken the lead on this, bringing everyone together to put this system in place. Clearly, United Way is the gold star entity for a place-based strategy. So the idea of collaboration was clear.
You've heard of 311. Well, now the city has a new hotline connecting residents to Chicago's social services.
Chicago's new 211 hotline now going live.
The call, text, or virtual chat is answered by a real person with United Way of Metro Chicago.
We're told 211 has assisted over 100,000 people across Chicago and Cook County.
The cars are lined up outside the Robbins Park District. United Way will distribute some 500 of these boxes here, including basic food items, toys, and stuffed animals.
CBS 2 is proud to partner with the United Way as a sponsor for April Food Day.
United Way is with us to rebuild our community. That's deep partnership support.
All right. Well, thank you again. We hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about United Way and love seeing all the new introductions coming into the chat. Again, please feel free to keep it going, keep the conversation going. We're here live with you and happy to help as well. But now we will move into our feature presentation, our conversation with Shermann Dilla Thomas. This conversation was preceded by a tour we went on with Dilla's tour company, Chicago Mahogany. So I'll just note that you'll see footage from both the interview and the tour itself. And as we mentioned, hope to stay connected. So now we'll go ahead and turn to that broadcast. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our Martin Luther King Jr. Day conversation with Shermann Dilla Thomas as he shares his bold take on Dr. King's legacy. Martin Luther King Jr. Day offers an opportunity to reflect on where we've come from, what we've achieved together, and the critical work ahead of continuing to build a stronger, more equitable Chicago region, a region that offers every individual and family, no matter their zip code, the same opportunities to thrive. At United Way, we're committed to this work through our place-based approach, our neighborhood network initiative, and our commitment to helping neighbors meet their immediate basic needs. Thank you to our event sponsors, the Lamar Johnson Collaborative, Clayco, and CRG, and our Equity in Action founding sponsor, Winston & Strawn. Today, I'm honored to introduce Shermann Dilla Thomas, Chicago's favorite urban historian, who will share more on Martin Luther King Jr.'s connection to Chicago. As an avid history buff, Dilla came up with the idea of producing short videos focusing on the history of Chicago. The rest of the story is, as they say, history. Today, Dilla has more than 116,000 followers on TikTok, plus tens of thousands on Instagram and X, and recently launched a new YouTube series called You Don't Know Shy. Through his tour company, Chicago Mahogany Tours, Dilla leads guests through neighborhoods on Chicago's south and west sides to learn more about the rich history, culture, and promise of these communities. Today, Dilla will be joined by our very own Jackie Rosa, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for United Way of Metro Chicago. Jackie is a lifelong Chicagoan with nearly 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. Through her current role, Jackie leads growth and strategy for United Way's public policy and programming efforts, plus the operations of 211 Metro Chicago, a free 24/7 health and social services helpline for Cook County residents. We are thrilled to have both Dilla and Jackie join us today as we celebrate Dr. King. Without further ado, please welcome Jackie and Dilla.
Thank you all for joining us today, and a special thank you to Dilla for your partnership with United Way and spending some time with us and our audience at home this morning, talking about Dr. King and his impact on Chicago. Last fall, United Way of Metro Chicago and Dilla teamed up to tell Chicago's story. Through a series of tours, events such as this one today, and social media content, we're working together to share the culture and history of our city and the exciting impact happening in our neighborhood networks. Dilla's Chicago Mahogany Bus Tours are a great way to spend a couple of hours experiencing some of Chicago's most history-rich neighborhoods on the south and west sides, including many of our neighborhood networks. To give you a taste of what you can expect to experience on a Chicago Mahogany tour, we've pulled together a brief recap video from one of our most recent tours.
Those who don't know me, my name is Dilla. I'm a Chicago historian, lifelong Chicagoan. Lived on the South Side my whole life, public school educated, and then started a TikTok channel about the history of Chicago. And it was really started to combat some of the negativity that permeates the internet and the national news as it relates to our city. Today we're here to talk about Dr. King's time in Chicago. We're now in North Lawndale. North Lawndale is where King spent a ton of time doing his Chicago Freedom Campaign. It's also where Dr. King lived. He moves here in the winter of 1965. And the thing that brings him to Chicago is housing. In 1965/66, King was already a rock star. He had already won the Nobel Peace Prize. He had already given the I Have a Dream speech. He could have lived anywhere. When he made the decision to come to Chicago, they offered to put him up in the Palmer House. He said no, because he wanted to live like people actually lived over here. People are there to speak about what they're living through and the living conditions as it relates to segregation, inadequate housing for the poor, lack of public housing, absentee landlords, And it was all these things that brought King to Chicago. On this tour, we're gonna talk about the past, but we're also gonna talk about the legacy of King that's alive today. What I like to say on all tours is that if something has a name, it has a history. You see a name of a school, Google it, and see why that name is that name, and see what kind of lessons of history we can learn by simply learning the history behind the names that we pass by every day. Michelle Clark High School. So Michelle Clark happens to be the first black woman to be an on-air news anchor for CBS. In fact, she was on the short list to be one of the co-hosts for 60 Minutes. Douglas Park. Formerly it was named after Stephen A. Douglas. Some little girl decided to find out the history behind the name. Not only was she able to come to grips with it, but she was able to do something for the future. We changed the name of Douglas Park to Douglas Park. We simply added an S at the end, and now it's named for Frederick and Anna Douglass, the black abolitionists. Now other little kids who spend time in this massively beautiful park will not have to spend that time playing under the moniker of a person who didn't respect them as human beings. And that's sure enough an example of King's spirit being alive today. Part of all my tours, we visit something cool and local, so we're gonna step into the Be Love. There's a lot of organizations that get to really do good work because of generosity of folks like you all who are on the bus. You know, it makes a difference. I'm humbled by the stuff that I hear from people. Think what we just did for Be Love Cafe. And I'm able to do that for small businesses from the support I get from folks like the United Way. And when non-for-profits and organizations and activists come to marginalized spaces and provide simply information, it's transformative. You know, I like to say I'm the byproduct of when you all get it right. I don't arrive here to have the freedom to research Chicago in the way that I was able to. Organizations at every turn ain't helping me, ain't doing certain things, ain't providing me with information. And that's how we really push King legacies forward. Getting ready to show you something though that you can only see from the west side. This is the original Sears Tower to the country and to the city. It's still standing right now. So it's the only place in Chicago where you can see old Sears Tower and new. I imagine it's like a grandpa looking at his grandson, like, look at my boy, he done made it downtown.
Good morning, Dilla. That video was so fun. I really enjoyed going on the tour with you today. We're here at Build today, which is a beautiful campus that actually didn't exist the way that it is now, as large and expansive as it is now. Build is an anchor organization for one of our neighborhood networks, the Austin Neighborhood Network. Build provides programming for young people, specifically on the city's west side, but also for young people across Chicago City. Dilla, would love to hear a little bit about, who you are, why this work is so important to you, and how you came to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a native Southsider. I've been living in Auburn Gresham my entire life. My dad was a Chicago police officer. My mom was a nurse here. Public educated, but I spent my dad was at one point vice president of the African American Police League. Okay. That was a league that fought and advocated for the rights of black cops inside of the department. And so they spent a lot of time around history makers and being around folks like Senator Carol Moseley Braun or Mayor Eugene Sawyer or Mayor Harold Washington. You would hear all these stories of the past, and that's really what piqued my interest about the history of Chicago. And then I've been fortunate enough to be the type of person that received kind of the best of Chicago. When Richard M. Daley started the Mayor Daley summer jobs, I was part of one of those first cohorts to get a summer job, and so ended up working in City Hall and getting to see how the city works from that vantage point. I was a lifeguard for about 10 summers. And I got to go to different sides in the city and work at different pools and different beaches. And I got to really take in the culture. And then as a meter reader for the light company, I got to see Chicago from a ground up kind of viewpoint. It really made me love the city. And so that's where my love of the history of the city comes from. I gained my platform from TikTok, from trying to combat the negative stories that you see on social media. And so it felt weird to live and then leave this earth and not tell all these stories that I had learned and all these history facts. And so that's what got me started, just wanting to make sure that the stories lived on.
That's great. So as one Chicagoan native to another, what high school did you go to? That's the number one question.
Number one question. I went to Calumet High School,
Okay.
and sadly it's no longer open. It was on 81st and May. Big, beautiful building that I hope we do something with sometime soon. Amazing people like Shaka Khan and Kirby Puckett went to Calumet High School. A lot of amazing people went there, so glad to be a part of that history.
And now I'd love to jump into some questions about MLK.
Absolutely.
Can you briefly describe MLK's work in Chicago and Chicago's response?
Yes, so Dr. King came to Chicago in the late winter of 1965 to work with a gentleman by the name of Al Raby for what they were calling the Chicago Freedom Campaign. It was primarily a campaign to address housing inequity here in Chicago, particularly the fact that despite the fact that residential segregation had become illegal, it was still taking place on a large scale here in Chicago. And inside of these segregated black neighborhoods, folks were living in dilapidated properties. As far as its impact, sadly, Chicago is still one of the most segregated places in the country, so I don't know if he moved a lot on that front. But what he was able to accomplish is after he left Chicago, he was able to help pass the Fair Housing Act, which certainly has a lot of effects in the city today. But in 1966, a guy by the name of Richard J. Daley had a lot of sway on the South Side. A lot of those pastors were not very friendly to King because they knew it would upset Old Man Daley. So much so that there's a church on 31st and King Drive. Olivet is the name of the church. And the pastor there was a guy by the name of Jackson. When they changed the name of South Parkway Boulevard to King Drive, he welded the doors shut on the King Drive side and cut a hole on the 31st side so he could change his address to East 31st so he wouldn't have to write Dr. King's name on an envelope. Richard Daley told the preachers on the South Side that if you open your doors up to this Southern troublemaker, you'll never get a building permit. You want to know how real that was? Go to Fellowship that's on 43rd Street, Clay Evans' former church. They didn't get a permit through to upgrade their church to 83. King and Daley were both gone, and they still were holding on to that grudge. But the West Side was an integrated space. There were Italians and Polish dudes and Jewish dudes and Greek dudes. And so that Democratic machine couldn't really put its teeth in like it could on the fully segregated South Side. And so because of that, they wasn't scared of him. And to show the dilapidated housing that black folks were living in, King moved on the West Side. This building that's standing there now used to look like this. And that's the day that Dr. King moved in, right? Number one cause of death for black kids back in those days was fire and rat bites. Speaks directly to the absentee landlordism that was happening in these spaces. If the back porch fell down in this neighborhood, the landlord would tell you simply use the front door. But if that happens and it's an emergency and you don't have a second egress, then it's a loss of life. Wouldn't patch up the holes, and so they literally would leave food in certain spaces to attract the rats so that they could at least sleep in peace. King's trying to shovel out the coal because we used to heat these buildings with coal, and the paparazzi's there even for that. He has these speeches and marches everywhere, Stateway Gardens. But then Dr. King decides to start marching. So first he marches through Bridgeport, but Daley's in Bridgeport, and Daley, it is not me joking, in the 60s, about 70% of all the jobs that people had living in Bridgeport was streets and sanitation, firemen, or police. So Daley was able to put out the word, don't embarrass Bridgeport on TV. So then King marched downtown, and again, nothing happened. But change wasn't happening either. So then King decides to march in Chicago Lawn. And they're going to march through Marquette Park. And that's where King says that he's seen racism all across the South, but never like he saw it here. And that's where he was hitting the head with a boulder. So then King decides to up the ante. He's going to go march in Cicero. He decided he was going to march through Cicero, and the people who hang out in Cicero contacted Daley directly. They said, we don't throw boulders in Cicero, we throw bullets. And if that N-word marches through Cicero, this is where they'll bury him. And so that's finally when Daley decided to have the meeting with King. And you say a lot about Richard J. Daley, but he wasn't dumb. The man graduated night school, law school. He went to law school at night and got a law degree. And he did the opposite of what they did in the South. In the South, they fought King at every turn. Where King gave Daley a demand list of about 16 demands he wanted to see change. And Daley said, you know what, you're right. I'm gonna change all of this, but I can't change it with you living in the city because people will think I lost power. So why don't you go back down south, and as soon as you leave, we'll start changing stuff. They had a handshake agreement. And when King left, nothing changed. But that lesson he learned in Chicago taught him his most important lesson. Do not leave without the paperwork. So he went back to D.C. and he stayed until they passed the Fair Housing Act, which is the thing that changed the way that housing is done here in this country, and it gives you legal recourse when you're discriminated against when you're trying to live in the area. And he wouldn't have learned that lesson had he not come through Chicago. This site where King lived should have a mile marker in front of it, should have a plaque from the city of Chicago, but it doesn't. It only has that sign there because of the North Lawndale Christian Development Corporation wanting to acknowledge the spot. And that's a travesty, because what do we call the area by Buckingham Fountain? Queen's Landing. Queen Elizabeth came to Chicago one time, and she pulled up there one time, and just that occurrence made us call that whole thing Queen's Landing, right? There's a sign in front of the house where Walt Disney was born, right? And you go out to Oak Brook, there's signs in front of Hemingway's house, right? And we should have a sign in the spot where Dr. King lived for a year here in Chicago. So I'm happy that North Lawndale Christian Development decided to create market rate and low income housing on this site. And the fact that they believe so much in this site, they got UIC to put a neighborhood center here. And now if you have that on your this zip code on your ID, you'll get free tutoring and they'll pay for your ACT test and your SAT test. And then because of this space being here, you get the Soul Food Lounge, one of the first sit-down restaurants to anchor itself on the west side in 30 years. And try to go in there today, you're gonna need a reservation because it's always booked.
On the tour, one of the things I found really fascinating that you talked about was, back to Dr. King's legacy here in Chicago was, when he came, he was, I think you called him a rock star, right? Yeah. So he was already very well known. And what I thought was really impactful was the fact that Dr. King was very adamant about staying and living in community while he was here. So can you talk a little bit about that and why it's so important even today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, I love that he made that decision, because how can you fight and advocate for people if you don't understand what they're going through? And so the fact that Dr. King decided to live amongst the people, he moved here in the winter of '65. In '63, he had already did the I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. In '64, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was certainly a household name in the winter of '65, and there would have been no shortage of philanthropists or rich dudes or hotels who would have put him up absolutely for free just out of the sheer notoriety of having him there. And he recognized that he can't change how people are living unless he understood how they were living. And so he picked a dilapidated property in North Lawndale, right on the corner of 16th and Hamlin. And that's where he lived for about 11 months. And I think it just shows the type of person that he was, right? And not just him, but his wife and his family too, because they all had to sacrifice, right? They had a nice home in Atlanta, and to have to come here and live. It wasn't a well-maintained property. And that is what I believed is what gave him the courage and the understanding to fight to try to change the way that other folks were living in urban cities.
And I also want to kind of point out that, a lot of the communities, unfortunately, that Dr. King visited while in Chicago, lived in while in Chicago, have been systemically disinvested in, right? So decades of disinvestment, decades without the resources that other neighborhoods in the cities have gotten. So unfortunately, that disinvestment has led to negative sort of thoughts about the city's south and west sides. Obviously, we know that's not true. What do you think people most misunderstand about neighborhoods on the south and west side?
One of the things I think that they misunderstand the most about the neighborhoods on the south and west side is how connected they are to the other sides of the city. If you're a person living on the north side or the west loop or south loop or Lakeview, and you're upset about the rising tax rates, it's because of the disinvestment that happens on the South and West Side. If the South and West Side is invested in and they have economic engines, taxable economic engines, then that lowers the amount of taxes that we need to raise in other spaces. So there's a direct correlation between the two. The other thing is there's this narrative that once you visit the South or West Side, something inherently violent is going to happen to you, or there's no culture in those spaces, and that's absolutely untrue. By and large, Southsiders and Westsiders, we mind our own business, and so if you're not coming to those spaces as a troublemaker, you're going to leave as you came, which is safe. And there are a lot of amazing cultural institutions and things to learn and see on the South and West Side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Dr. King was fighting for equity and for economic freedom for Black citizens. How do you feel that he would feel about the progress made towards those goals today?
How would Dr. King feel about the progress made today? I think on the one hand, right, he'd be very impressed that Chicago is the place that gave America its first Black president, right? You know, nowhere else could the story of Barack Obama have happened in the way that it happened outside of Chicago. It couldn't have happened in any other city in this country. I think he'd be very impressed to see that the Chicago Bears president is a Black dude. He'd be very impressed to see, you know, members of African American community on the board of directors of World Business Chicago. He'd be impressed to see spaces like Sip and Savor and Ain't She Sweet Cafe and all these amazing Black-owned businesses. But at the same time, he would be upset because he'd see that there's still disproportionately there's less investment in these areas, and there's still a lot more to do, right? And you would hope within 60 years of time would have gotten it together, and sadly we haven't. Everybody see that building there? It looks like it's been in a lot better shape. Building used to look like what's on your screen. It's where Allstate Insurance was founded. Allstate at one point was a subsidiary of the Sears Roebuck and Company. Not just that, Discover Credit Card was founded right over here. They were also a subsidiary, Sears Roebuck and Company. Think about how many jobs and how different the West Side would be if these anchoring financial institutions had stayed on the West Side of Chicago. But their leaving took so many jobs and took the stability away from the housing around here.
That's a great segue into sort of what, you know, United Way neighborhood networks are all about, right? It's investing in community, but having it be community driven, meaning that, you know, United Way, while we want to support community, at the end of the day, we're not going to ultimately decide what's best for community. So, you know, I think one of the things that we find that works so well with this partnership is your commitment to telling the history of Chicago, but also helping preserve that history. Can you tell us why that's important and integral into your tours?
Preserving and telling the history of Chicago is very integral to my tours because we're all walking on sacred ground, right? And in order to understand what you have, you need to understand how you acquired it, right? And so if you're living in any of these neighborhoods in Chicago, a lot took place in order for these neighborhoods to form, and we should acknowledge those stories. And everybody's story matters, and I think that that's something that we need to do better as a city, right? Sometimes we lift up some stories and not other stories, and when we tell the history of these marginalized spaces, it shows the impact that these spaces have had on the city and the country as a whole, and shows what's possible from those spaces. I'm always talking about sacred ground, particularly in spaces like this. That's the Douglas Park Library. Also went through the name change, and so it's also now named after Frederick and Anna Douglass. I would be madly impressed if somebody on here who is able to tell me who's the Librarian of Congress right now. So her name is Carla Hayden. She's a Chicagoan, grew up South Shore neighborhood, went to South Shore High School, ended up going to Roosevelt University where she got her master's in library sciences, and then she went on to be a librarian, right? And that's the building that she was a librarian in. And I think it's really cool that the kids that go there now to, you know, use the services of the Chicago Public Library are standing in a building that the former Librarian of Congress worked in. If you're unfamiliar with that, if right now you want to make a documentary about the 1930s, you're going to want some folk music from the 30s and old pictures, you're going to contact the Library of Congress because they have the country's most expansive archives. You're following something political. You want to know about William Lorimer, who's the reason why we now vote for U.S. senators. the state legislator used to send the U.S. senators to the House of Congress, but then a Chicagoan by the name of William Lorimer, he bribed the Illinois state legislator to get sent there. And then this other guy had a change of heart, so he told the Trib that he accepted the bribe. And then they voted William Lorimer out, and then they enacted the 19th Amendment, which now allows us to vote for the 2 U.S. senators. You're gonna get all that information from the Library of Congress. If you write a really, really kick-butt book, right, they may accept your book in the Library of Congress where it'll be preserved. And so that's a very, very important job. It's a presidential appointment. And Carla Hayden is the first black woman to be appointed to that position from Chicago. That building also had a librarian who went on to become the Prime Minister of Israel. Her name is Golden Meir. Golden Meir is from Wisconsin, but she moved to Chicago and was raised in what we used to call the Jerusalem of Chicago, Lawndale. And she too became a librarian. She was a librarian in that building. And so you've had the Librarian of Congress and the former Prime Minister of a nation state right there. And that should tell us all that greatness can and has and can continue to come from North Lawndale.
So one of our neighborhood networks, Austin, is a community in Chicago that is part of your tours as well. Can you talk a little bit about Austin's rich community and why it is important to Chicago's history?
Yeah, absolutely. I love Austin as a community and as a neighborhood space. It's at this point, it's the largest community area in Chicago, right? More people live in Austin than any other neighborhood, community area. Austin is one of our oldest, full of, chocked with history. Austin is named after this dude, Henry Austin. It should be stated that, all of Chicago and Chicagoland area was formerly and still is owned by the indigenous Native Americans that we jacked it from. Particularly the tribes of Miami, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe. It is certainly fair to say that the land of Chicago, known as Smelly Onions to the Algonquin, is their land, and the Anglo-Saxon dudes came and they jacked them. Particularly a guy by the name of Billy Cogwell. His neighborhood is so Billy Cogwell was half Native, half Irish, so he was like an agent on behalf of the United States. And he came and he tricked the indigenous that lived here to sign the Treaty of Chicago in 1832. So next time you're in Rogers Park and you go by Indian Boundary Park, it has that name because after Saginaw, that's why that neighborhood has its name, after Saginaw had them sign that treaty, Native Americans couldn't pass that Indian boundary, right? So then this area becomes, these dudes were Anglo-Saxon dudes from like the UK and all of that, and Henry Austin lays out the land. Now, I will give Henry Austin credit. He was an abolitionist. He wasn't with all that slavery mumbo jumbo, so we give him a half. He didn't want black people living in Austinville. That's a whole nother thing. He didn't want them to be slaves. He just didn't want them to be his neighbors. So that's why you get a half. I can give you a half, like maybe a pound. You don't get the pound hug, you just get the pound, you know what I'm saying? Austin, the neighborhood of Austin was formerly his own town. It's called Austinville. In fact, Central, where Laredo Hospital is, it's called Central because that was the center of the town of Austinville. I love spaces like Michelle Clark High School, which is really, really close to where we're filming now, and they're doing transformative things inside of that school. They're teaching young kids how to have small businesses, so they do entrepreneurial incubation. Now, Michelle Clark, having been first ever African-American on-air personality for CBS, that's already enough history as it stands, right? But she happened to be the child of Mr. and Mrs. Clark. This is Michelle Clark right here. And the Clarks, so as you see, the lady is very fair-skinned. She almost looked like a dark-skinned Italian lady. And so her husband fought valiantly during World War II. They were living in Mississippi. They migrate to Gary, and they're living in the slums in Gary. And so he gets a pretty decent job and he wants to move. And so he sends his wife to find an apartment. She discovers a beautiful apartment in Cicero, Illinois. She goes, the landlord sees her, and the lady who's a property owner, she's like, oh yeah, cool new Italian family. So then the husband and the rest of the kids move in. And the town of Cicero riots. This is what happened to that lady's building. They burned the building down. Not just that, they throw the piano out the third floor window and set it on fire. Not just that, the National Guard has to come in to quell the violence. 1951. Just in 1950 that we got rid of racial covenant laws via the Supreme Court. Formerly, it was legal to keep black people out of Cicero. But starting in 1950, that becomes unconstitutional. And so the family tries to move in there. Now, right now, we have a vacant house next to my house. And we told the owner, do not board it up, because boarded up houses attract all kind of crap. And me and the other dudes on the block, we rock, paper, scissors to see who gonna shovel the snow and who gotta throw the salt. You know, whoever got the riding lawnmower out that day, just keep riding, cut the grass. We'll drop some money in the mailbox, right? And, you know, I move the cans every now and again. And they came and they showed the house to somebody. And 3 of the young guys look like they might be into street politics. So my fingers are crossed, like, please, God, don't let them get this house. My teenage sons ain't into all of that. I'm winning right now. I say all that to say it's okay to be worried about who moves into your neighborhood, right? You get a bad neighbor, oh, life is terrible, right? Because you guys live next to each other. Having said that, Mr. Clark was a World War II veteran who had risked his life to continue freedom around this mofo, right? He had an excellent job. He was a married man with his kids, beautiful family, got his kids wearing bow ties in the dang on 50s, right? No reason to be worried about this person, but the simple fact that he was black is what has Cicero riots over a veteran. It's not just some regular dude, not a guy who made his money rolling dice. Michelle Clark was the young lady who lived through that. Eventually, they make their home in the Woodlawn neighborhood. It was absolutely crazy. The lady who was the landlord, she tries to sue the Clark family for $1 million for the damages that happened to her property because they tried to do the small and simple thing of just moving into a nice space. And that's happening in 1951. King comes 14 years later. We're here 60 years later and we're still dealing with those issues. Love organizations like Build that's providing like wraparound services. You pull up to Build in the summertime in the front and you see community gardens and they're teaching people how to become urban farmers. I love Westside United that operates out of Austin as well. They're doing amazing and awesome things as it relates to transforming closed down buildings and repopulating them. You know, Austin has such a rich history. It was a integrated group of women in Austin that actually discovered the practice of redlining, which would led to the class action lawsuit that ended redlining as a practice with banks and the government. So you can't understate, you know, the history and importance of this neighborhood.
You know, obviously today the focus is on Dr. King's legacy and, you know, the history and the change maker that he was. Are there other leaders or community leaders that we should be thinking about when we talk about the south and west sides of the city, right, that have also have similar legacies but may not be as known nationally?
Yeah, absolutely. There are people like Earl B. Dickerson who we should lift up, who was a thought leader and a change maker here in Chicago. People like Father Michael Flager, who's around today doing transformative work on the Auburn Gresham community. People like Carlos Nelson, who's really into pushing the economics of spaces. There are activists like Tanika Johnson who we should talk about and we should lift up. But there are also people in the past that have helped change spaces, right? We should spend a little time talking about Dr. Margaret Burroughs, who's the founder of the DuSable Museum and the impact that she's left behind. We should talk about Dr. George Cleveland Hall, who's one of the early surgeons at Providence Hospital and one of the founders of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. We should talk about Fred Hampton. You know, there's so many folks we should speak about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are always left inspired by the work that you do and the tours that we take. And I think that, you know, as we think about many Chicago residents who work every day to make things better for their neighborhoods, what words of inspiration do you have for those history makers of tomorrow?
I love how you frame that because simply going to work every day, right? Walking your dog in the neighborhood, being a person that picks up the poo, signing your kids up for local ballet classes, local Little League and T-ball. Those are very historic and heroic things, and that's what pushes the community forward. And a lot of times it's kind of thankless, right? You think you're just going to work and you're paying your bills, and what you're actually doing is you're preserving a community. The more that you stay in these courtyard apartments and these two flats and these gravestones that are architectural gems, the more that we preserve them, the more that they'll be around for others. And the more that, another thing that we should do and continue to do, and that many Chicagoans do, is just support each other, right? You may not have a ton of money to donate to spaces, but donate your time. Show up to local school council meetings, show up to park advisory board meetings, and have a say-so on what takes place in your community, and that's a great way to preserve what you have in your community.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, again, thank you so much, Dilla. We always appreciate our time with you and look forward to many more tours.
Right on, thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you. Make sure. Okay, there we go. Thank you, everyone. We hope you got to enjoy a bit of one of Dilla's tours without ever leaving your house, which is a good thing on a day like today in Chicago. I know I always feel like a better Chicagoan after listening to Dilla, and I hope you learned something too. If you'd like to stay in touch with United Way, we have several upcoming opportunities. You can see them coming up here on your screen. First, if you've ever considered joining a nonprofit board, we encourage you to check out our Board Leadership Institute, which is a training program we run to equip professionals for service on nonprofit boards. Our applications are currently open for our spring cohort, but the deadline for those is this Friday. So please check it out soon if you're interested. On March 13th, our Women United Affinity Group will be hosting their annual breakfast, which will feature an engaging keynote speaker and also ample opportunity for networking. The following month will be April Food Day, which is focused on food security in the Southland. You saw a clip of it in our video preceding the Dilla interview today. And finally, in May, we'll have our Stronger Neighborhoods Awards Luncheon, which is our annual celebration of our accomplishments and our partners and partnerships. You can scan the QR code, and we also have the link there to our events webpage, just to always be able to know what's coming up in our events at United Way. And I also just want to thank again our sponsors who helped make this event possible. So thank you to the Lamar Johnson Collaborative, Clayco, and CRG. Our MLK Day event today is part of our Equity in Action series, which is supported by our founding sponsor, Winston & Strawn. So thank you again to all of our sponsors. And again, we've been so pleased at United Way of Metro Chicago to be in partnership with Dilla and Chicago Mahogany. If you'd like to learn more about Dilla, we highly recommend attending a Chicago Mahogany bus tour. The QR code, on your screen now will connect you to Chicago Mahogany's website, where you can buy tickets for an upcoming tour. He does this same tour, a version of the same tour in kind of North Lawndale, Austin area, and also lots of other communities around the South and West sides. Highly recommend. And you can also purchase some of Dilla's fun merchandise. So again, scan this code and it'll take you to his website. And that concludes our broadcast for today. Thank you again so much for being here, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your Martin Luther King Day. Stay warm out there.